In a time when chaos reigned and faith wavered, God raised up unexpected heroes from the most unlikely places. A left-handed assassin who used deception to free his people. A woman who drove a tent peg through an enemy commander's skull. A fearful farmer who became a mighty warrior with just 300 men. A judge who sacrificed his own daughter to keep a vow. And a man whose supernatural strength lay hidden in his uncut hair. These were the judges of Israel, deliverers chosen not for their perfection, but for their willingness to answer God's call in desperate times. For over 3 centuries, Israel was trapped in a devastating cycle. They would abandon God, fall into enemy hands, cry out for mercy, and be rescued by a judge, only to repeat the pattern again. Each story is more dramatic than the last, filled with divine intervention, brutal battles, cunning strategies, and tragic consequences. From Deborah's prophetic wisdom to Gideon's midnight raid, from Samson's riddles to Jephthah's heartbreaking vow, these accounts reveal both the faithfulness of God and the stubborn hearts of his people. Prepare to witness how God transforms ordinary people into extraordinary instruments of deliverance, proving that his power is made perfect in human weakness. The story begins with a heartbreaking turn. After Joshua died, something terrible happened to Israel. The book of Judges, chapter 2, verse 10, tells us that after that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Can you imagine? A whole generation that forgot about God. They didn't know about the miracles at the Red Sea, the walls of Jericho falling down, or how God had fought for their parents and grandparents. These young Israelites grew up in the Promised Land, but they never learned the stories. They never understood who had given them this land. And without that knowledge, without that connection to God, they started looking around at their neighbors. The Canaanites had their own gods, their own ways of worship, and it all seemed so normal, so acceptable. As Judges 2:12 explains, they forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. They aroused the Lord's anger. The Israelites didn't just forget God. They actively turned away from him. They started serving Baal and the Ashtoreths, the false gods of the land. These weren't just harmless statues. Baal worship involved practices that God had strictly forbidden, rituals that degraded human dignity and violated everything God had taught his people about holiness and purity. They married the people God had told them to drive out. They adopted foreign customs and foreign beliefs. The warnings had been clear. Moses had told them this would happen if they compromised. Joshua had pleaded with them to remain faithful before he died. But memories fade, and without deliberate teaching and remembering, even the most powerful experiences can be lost. Everything God had warned them about through Moses and Joshua was now happening. The covenant their fathers had made at Mount Sinai meant nothing to this new generation. They broke every promise, ignored every warning, and walked away from the God who had loved them and delivered them. God's response was both just and measured. He had warned them this would happen. Judges 2:14 records that the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, so that he gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. This wasn't random cruelty, it was the consequence they had been warned about. God had told them through Moses that if they turned to other gods, he would remove his protection. Every time Israel went out to fight, they lost. The Bible says in verse 15, whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. Think about that. The same God who had once fought for them, who had stopped the sun in the sky for Joshua, who had made walls collapse with trumpet blasts, that same God was now against them in battle. Their enemies, the very nations they were supposed to drive out, now dominated them. Raiders came and took their crops, their livestock, their possessions. Israel became weak and vulnerable, powerless before nations they should have conquered. But here's where we see God's heart. Even in his anger, he didn't abandon them completely. Judges 2:16 tells us, "Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders." God saw their suffering, he heard their cries, and despite their unfaithfulness, despite their repeated betrayals, he provided deliverers, leaders who would rescue them from oppression. This shows us something beautiful about God's character. His anger is real, his justice is sure, but his mercy keeps breaking through. Yet the pattern was already forming, and it was a heartbreaking one. Verse 17 says, "Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them." They quickly turned from the ways of their ancestors, who had been obedient to the Lord's commands. Even when God sent help, the people refused to truly change. They would be rescued, enjoy peace for a while, and then fall right back into sin. It was like watching someone make the same mistake over and over, never learning from the pain it caused. Judges 2:18 shows us God's compassion even in this cycle. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. God felt their pain. He heard their groans. Even though they had brought this suffering on themselves, he couldn't stand by and watch them suffer without offering help. But then verse 19 completes the devastating picture. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshipping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. Not only did they return to sin, but they became worse than before. Each generation seemed to sink deeper into rebellion. This cycle would repeat itself over and over throughout the book of Judges. Sin, suffering, crying out to God, deliverance, peace, and then right back to sin again. It's a pattern that shows both the patience of God and the stubbornness of human hearts. The first test of this cycle came quickly. Judges 3:7 states, "The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asherahs." It didn't take long after the generation of Joshua died for Israel to fall into sin. They forgot God, not just forgot to think about him, but forgot his character, his works, his commands. And into that spiritual vacuum came false gods. Because of this, verse 8 tells us, "The anger of the Lord burned against Israel, so that he sold them into the hands of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Aram-Naharaim, to whom the Israelites were subject for 8 years. Cushan-Rishathaim, even his name sounds intimidating. He was a king from Mesopotamia, from the region between the two rivers far to the north. For 8 long years, Israel lived under his rule, experiencing the bitterness of serving a foreign king instead of serving their true king, the Lord. 8 years is a long time. Children were born and grew up knowing only oppression. Families struggled under the burden of foreign rule. Every day reminded them of what they had lost. Finally, the Israelites remembered God and cried out to him for help. And God, faithful to his nature, answered. Judges 3:9 says, "But when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them." Othniel wasn't just anyone. He was Caleb's nephew from the tribe of Judah. You might remember Caleb as one of the 2 spies who had faith that God could give them the promised land 40 years earlier when everyone else was afraid. That same courage and faith ran in the family. Othniel had even proven himself before by capturing the city of Kiriath-Sepher and winning Caleb's daughter Aksah as his wife, as recorded earlier in Joshua. He was already known as a warrior, a man of action and courage. Now God called him to an even greater task, to deliver all of Israel from foreign oppression. Judges 3:10 records what happened. "The Spirit of the Lord came on him, so that he became Israel's judge and went to war. The Lord gave Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Aram, into the hands of Othniel, who overpowered him. Notice that crucial detail. It was God's Spirit that empowered Othniel. This phrase, "the Spirit of the Lord came on him," appears multiple times in Judges, always marking the moment when God specially equipped someone for a great task. It wasn't just Othniel's skill or strength. God was with him, working through him to deliver his people. The victory was complete and decisive. Cushan-Rishathaim was defeated, driven back to his distant homeland. Israel was free once more. Verse 11 tells us the beautiful result. So the land had peace for 40 years, until Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. 40 years of peace. An entire generation grew up without war, without oppression, without foreign rulers. Children played safely, families farmed their land in security, and Israel served God under Othniel's leadership. But notice that ominous phrase at the end. Until Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. The peace lasted as long as the judge lived. This pattern would repeat throughout the book. The judge's presence kept the people faithful, but once that godly leader was gone, the people's hearts would wander once again. It shows us how much we need good leaders who point us to God, and how quickly we can drift when those leaders are gone. After Othniel died, the pattern repeated itself with predictable sadness. Judges 3:12 says, "Again the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and because they did this evil, the Lord gave Eglon, king of Moab, power over Israel." The word "again" tells the whole story. They did it again. They forgot God again. They turned to idols again. And so God used their enemies as a tool of discipline, allowing Eglon, the king of Moab, to grow strong against them. Eglon wasn't content to oppress Israel alone. Verse 13 continues, "Getting the Ammonites and Amalekites to join him, Eglon came and attacked Israel, and they took possession of the city of palms." The city of palms was Jericho, the very city whose walls God had miraculously brought down for Joshua. Now it was in enemy hands. Eglon formed an alliance with other nations who hated Israel, and together they conquered and occupied Israelite territory. Verse 14 tells us how long this lasted. The Israelites were subject to Eglon, king of Moab, for 18 years. 18 years is more than twice as long as the first oppression. An entire generation grew up knowing only Moabite rule. They paid taxes to a foreign king, obeyed his laws, and lived as second-class citizens in their own land. Finally, after 18 years of hardship, the Israelites cried out to the Lord again. And once more, God answered their cry with a deliverer. His name was Ehud, and he was from the tribe of Benjamin. Judges 3:15 describes him with an interesting detail. Ehud, a left-handed man, the son of Gera the Benjamite. Now, being left-handed might not seem important, but it would prove crucial to God's plan. In fact, the Hebrew phrase used here is even more specific. It literally means restricted in his right hand, suggesting he may have been unable to use his right hand normally. What looked like a weakness would become a strength. The Israelites sent Ehud to bring tribute payment to King Eglon, the taxes and gifts they had to pay to their oppressor. But Ehud came prepared with more than money. Judges 3:16 explains, "Now Ehud had made a double-edged sword, about a cubit long, which he strapped to his right thigh under his clothing. A cubit was about 18 inches, short enough to hide, long enough to be deadly. Most warriors wore their swords on their left side to draw with their right hand, but Ehud, being left-handed, wore his on the right side, hidden under his robe. This meant guards checking him for weapons would look in the usual place and find nothing suspicious. Ehud delivered the tribute to Eglon. The Bible describes Eglon in verse 17 as a very fat man. This detail isn't just descriptive, it becomes significant to the story. After presenting the tribute, Ehud sent away all the people who had carried it with him. Then, at the stone idols near Gilgal, Ehud turned back. He had unfinished business with the king. He approached Eglon again with a bold claim recorded in verse 19. "I have a secret message for you, your majesty." Intrigued, Eglon ordered everyone out of the room, saying, "Leave us." All the attendants left. Eglon was alone with Ehud in his cool upper room, exactly where Ehud wanted him. The king probably expected good news, maybe inside information about Israel's defenses or political intrigue. He had no idea what was really about to happen. Ehud came closer to the king, who was sitting alone in his summer room. Judges 3:20 says, "Ehud then approached him while he was sitting alone in the upper room of his palace and said, 'I have a message from God for you,' as the king rose from his seat. And that's when Ehud struck. It happened in a flash. Verse 21 describes what happened. Ehud reached with his left hand, drew the sword from his right thigh, and plunged it into the king's belly. The assassination was swift and brutal. Verse 22 continues with graphic details. Even the handle sank in after the blade, and his bowels discharged. Ehud did not pull the sword out, and the fat closed in over it. Because of Eglon's obesity, the sword disappeared completely into his body, swallowed up by the fat. The handle went in after the blade. King Eglon, the man who had oppressed Israel for 18 years, the man who had taken the city of palms and ruled over God's people, was dead on the floor of his own palace. Ehud didn't panic. Despite having just killed a king in his own palace, surrounded by guards and servants, Ehud acted with remarkable calm and cleverness. Judges 3:23 tells us, "Then Ehud went out to the porch. He shut the doors of the upper room behind him and locked them. He walked right out of the room, closing and locking the doors, as if the king had simply dismissed him. Then he walked through the palace and out into the open, moving calmly and deliberately so as not to attract attention. By the time anyone discovered the king's body, Ehud would be long gone. And that's exactly what happened. The servants waited and waited outside the locked doors. Verse 24 explains their thinking. After he had gone, the servants came and found the doors of the upper room locked. They said he must be relieving himself in the inner room of the palace. This was a delicate situation. Nobody wants to interrupt a king in the bathroom. So they waited respectfully, assuming Eglon needed privacy. They waited and waited. Verse 25 says, "They waited to the point of embarrassment, but when he did not open the doors of the room, they took a key and unlocked them. There they saw their lord fallen to the floor, dead." Can you imagine their shock and horror? They had been standing outside while their king lay dead inside. The assassin had walked right past them. By now, considerable time had passed, and Ehud had a significant head start. Verse 26 confirms this. While they waited, Ehud got away. He passed by the stone images and escaped to Syria. Ehud made it to safety in the hill country, but he didn't stop to rest or celebrate. He didn't hide. Instead, he immediately went into action. Judges 3:27 records, when he arrived there, he blew a trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went down with him from the hills, with him leading them. The trumpet blast was a call to arms. It rallied the fighting men of Israel. Ehud wasn't just an assassin. He was a military leader ready to capitalize on the chaos and confusion his bold act had created. The Moabites would be leaderless, disorganized, and vulnerable. This was the moment to strike. Ehud gave the warriors a clear command in verse 28. "Follow me, for the Lord has given Moab, your enemy, into your hands." Notice what he said. This victory was from the Lord. Ehud had killed Eglon, yes, but he recognized that God was the true deliverer. He was simply God's instrument, and the men believed him and followed him into battle. The Israelites moved quickly and strategically. Still in verse 28 we read, "So they followed him down and took possession of the fords of the Jordan that led to Moab. They allowed no one to cross over." This was brilliant military strategy. By controlling the river crossings, they cut off any escape route for the Moabite forces in Israel. They also prevented reinforcements from coming across from Moab. the Moabite soldiers were trapped. Judges 3:29 tells us the result. At that time they struck down about 10,000 Moabites, all vigorous and strong, not one escaped. It was a complete and devastating victory. 10,000 enemy soldiers killed, with not a single escape. These weren't weak or untrained men. The Bible specifically says they were vigorous and strong, but they fell before Israel anyway because God had given them into Israel's hands. The oppression was over. The foreign king was dead. The enemy army was destroyed. Verse 30 concludes this chapter of deliverance with wonderful words. That day Moab was made subject to Israel, and the land had peace for 80 years. 80 years, twice as long as the peace under Othniel. 2 full generations would grow up in peace and security. God had used an unlikely hero, a left-handed man with a hidden sword and a clever plan to free his people from their enemies. What looked like a weakness, being left-handed in a right-handed world, became the key to victory. After the account of Ehud comes a brief but powerful story. Judges 3:31 gives us just one verse about the next deliverer. After Ehud came Shamgar, son of Anath, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad. He too saved Israel. That's it. One sentence about a man who killed 600 enemy soldiers. But what a sentence! Shamgar didn't have an army behind him. He didn't have time to gather troops or plan a military campaign. He didn't have a sword, spear, or any traditional weapon of war. An ox goad was simply a long wooden stick, usually about 8 to 10 feet long, with a pointed metal tip on one end and a small chisel on the other. Farmers used it to prod their oxen while plowing. You'd poke the animal with the pointed end to keep it moving and use the chisel end to scrape mud off the plow. It was an everyday farming tool, nothing more. Yet Shamgar used what he had in his hand, and God used him to deliver Israel from Philistine raiders. 600 Philistines fell before this farmer-turned-warrior. We don't know if this was one epic battle or many encounters over time. We don't know the circumstances that brought him face to face with 600 enemies. We don't know how long Shamgar judged Israel afterward or what else he accomplished. The Bible doesn't tell us those details. What matters is that when Israel needed saving, God raised up a deliverer, and that deliverer didn't need fancy weapons or a mighty army. He just needed to be willing to fight with whatever God put in his hands. Think about it. 600 trained soldiers with proper weapons against one farmer with a stick. By all logical calculation, Shamgar should have died. But with God, the calculation changes completely. Shamgar reminds us that God can use anyone. You don't need to be from an important family like Othniel was. You don't need to have a clever plan like Ehud had. You don't need the perfect tools or ideal circumstances. God looks for faithful people who will step up when needed, using whatever they have to serve him and help others. Sometimes the most unlikely people with the most unlikely tools accomplish the most remarkable things when God is with them. Once again, the cycle repeated itself. Judges 4:1 opens with those familiar, heartbreaking words. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, now that Ehud was dead. There's that word, again, the cycle continuing like a broken record. The people fell back into sin after their deliverer died, and God allowed consequences to come. Verse 2 explains, "So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. Sisera, the commander of his army, was based in Harosheth Hagoyim. This time the oppressor was a Canaanite king, one of the very people Israel was supposed to have driven out of the land completely. But because of their incomplete obedience and ongoing compromise, these Canaanites remained strong and now ruled over them. This oppression was particularly harsh and lasted a long time. Judges 4:3 tells us why. Because he had 900 chariots fitted with iron and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years, they cried to the Lord for help. 900 iron chariots. This was serious military power. Iron was expensive and difficult to work with in those days. Having 900 iron chariots meant Jabin had enormous wealth and resources. These chariots were the ancient world's equivalent of tanks, powerful, intimidating, nearly unstoppable in open battle. The spinning wheels with sharp blades could cut down infantry like wheat before a scythe. For 20 years, Sisera used these chariots to crush any resistance from Israel. The oppression was cruel, grinding, relentless. 20 years is long enough for children to be born, grow up, and become adults knowing nothing but oppression. But during this dark time, God had placed someone special in a position of leadership. Judges 4.4 introduces her. Now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at that time. Stop and think about how remarkable this is. A woman was judging God's people. In the ancient world, where leadership was almost exclusively reserved for men, where women had limited rights and roles, God chose a woman to lead his people. This wasn't a mistake or a compromise, it was God's deliberate choice. He chose Deborah, and she faithfully served him. Verse 5 tells us more about her work. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided. You mean there was even a tree named after her, the palm of Deborah. People knew exactly where to find her. They came from all over Israel with their problems, their disputes, their questions. When two people had a disagreement about property or a business deal gone wrong or a family matter, they came to Deborah. She listened to both sides and made fair judgments based on God's law. People trusted Deborah. They respected her wisdom. They accepted her authority. She was known as a prophetess, someone who heard from God and spoke his words to the people. Being a prophet wasn't just about predicting the future. It was about hearing God's voice clearly and communicating his will to others. Deborah had that gift, and she used it to lead God's people with wisdom and justice. Deborah wasn't just a judge in the legal sense, settling disputes and maintaining order. She was about to become a judge in the full military sense too, a deliverer who would lead Israel to freedom from their oppressors. But unlike the judges before her, who personally fought in battle, Deborah wouldn't be wielding a sword herself. Instead, God would use her to commission and encourage the warrior he had chosen for that specific task. Her role was just as crucial, just as much part of God's deliverance plan. Deborah received a clear message from God about how to defeat Sisera and his 900 iron chariots. She didn't keep this message to herself or wait for the right moment. She acted immediately. She sent for a man named Barak, son of Abinoam, who lived in Kadesh in the northern territory of Naphtali. Judges 4:6 records her message to him. "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun and lead them up to Mount Tabor." This was a direct command from God, delivered through his prophetess. Barak was to gather 10,000 warriors from two northern tribes, Naphtali and Zebulun. These tribes lived in the areas most affected by Jabin's oppression, so the men would have personal motivation to fight. Mount Tabor was a prominent mountain in the Jezreel Valley, rising about 1,800 feet above the surrounding plain. It would be their staging ground, their place of assembly. But God's plan didn't end there. Verse 7 continues with God's promise, "I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River and give him into your hands." This wasn't just a command to gather troops and hope for the best. God was promising specific action. He would personally lure Sisera and all those terrifying iron chariots to a specific location, the Kishon River. And there, at that river, he would deliver them into Barak's hands. The Kishon River ran through the Jezreel Valley. In the dry season, it was barely a stream, but in the rainy season it could swell dramatically. God knew what he was doing by choosing this location. Those heavy iron chariots that were so powerful on dry ground would become liabilities in muddy terrain near a swollen river. But Barak didn't know that yet. All he heard was that he was supposed to take 10,000 men against 900 iron chariots and a well-trained army. Barak's response revealed his lack of faith. Judges 4:8 says, Barak said to her, "If you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go." Think about what just happened. God Almighty, the creator of heaven and earth, the God who brought Israel out of Egypt, who parted the Red Sea, who brought down the walls of Jericho, that God had just commanded Barak to go and promised him victory. But Barak said, "Only if you come too, Deborah." He wanted the prophetess there with him. Maybe he needed her presence to feel confident that God's promise was real. Maybe he feared that without her there, God's promise wouldn't hold true. Maybe he just wanted someone else to share the responsibility. Whatever his reason, he made his obedience conditional. He should have said, "Yes, Lord, I'll go immediately." Instead, he essentially said, "I'll go, but only on my terms." Deborah agreed to go with him. She wouldn't let his weakness prevent God's plan from moving forward, but she delivered a prophecy that would sting Barak's pride. Verse 9 records her words. "Certainly I will go with you," said Deborah, "but because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." Barak would get his victory. God would keep his promise despite Barak's lack of faith. But Barak wouldn't get the glory. Because he lacked the courage to obey God's command with full trust, the honor of defeating the great commander Sisera would belong not to him, but to a woman. This was significant in their culture, where military glory belonged to warriors. Barak would lead the army and win the battle, but the defining moment, the killing of the enemy commander, would belong to someone else. And not just anyone else, but a woman, which in that culture would be seen as even more embarrassing for Barak. Then Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh, as she had promised. Verse 10 tells us what happened next. There Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali, and 10,000 men went up under his command. Deborah also went up with him. The army was assembled exactly as God had commanded. 10,000 men from the northern tribes, ready to face an enemy that had oppressed them for 20 years. The pieces were in place. God's plan to deliver Israel from cruel oppression was about to unfold in ways no one expected, demonstrating once again that God's ways are not our ways, and his power is made perfect in human weakness. When Sisera heard that Barak had gone up to Mount Tabor, he mobilized his entire military force. Judges 4:13 tells us, Sisera summoned from Harosheth Hagoyim to the Kishon River all his men and his 900 chariots fitted with iron. This was exactly what God had predicted through Deborah. Sisera brought every chariot, every soldier, every weapon he had. He thought he was marching to an easy victory. After all, what could 10,000 foot soldiers on a mountain do against 900 iron chariots? Deborah didn't hesitate. The moment had come. Judges 4:14 records her command to Barak. Then Deborah said to Barak, "Go. This is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" Notice her confidence. She didn't say maybe or hopefully. She declared with absolute certainty that God had already gone before them. The battle was won before it even started, because God was fighting for Israel. So Barak descended from Mount Tabor with his 10,000 men following him. They came down from the high ground, charging toward the enemy below. And then God moved. Judges 4:15 describes what happened. At Barak's advance, the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and army by the sword, and Sisera got down from his chariot and fled on foot. The word routed means thrown into complete confusion and panic. God caused chaos in the enemy ranks. Those 900 iron chariots that seemed so unstoppable became useless. Perhaps rain had turned the ground muddy, causing the heavy chariots to get stuck. Perhaps the horses panicked and couldn't be controlled. Perhaps God sent supernatural confusion that made the soldiers turn on each other. Whatever the means, the result was clear. The mighty army of Sisera fell apart, and Sisera himself, the great commander who had terrorized Israel for 20 years, abandoned his chariot and ran away on foot like a common soldier. Barak didn't stop. He pressed the advantage. Judges 4:16 continues, Barak pursued the chariots and army as far as Harosheth Hagoyim, and all Sisera's troops fell by the sword. Not a man was left. It was total destruction. The entire army that had oppressed Israel, gone. Every chariot destroyed or captured, every soldier killed, not one escaped. This was God's doing, his complete deliverance of his people from their oppressors. While Barak was chasing the army, Sisera was running for his life. He fled on foot until he came to an unlikely refuge. Judges 4:17 explains, Sisera meanwhile fled on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, because there was an alliance between Jabin king of Hazor and the family of Heber the Kenite. The Kenites were related to Moses through his father-in-law. Most Kenites were friendly to Israel, but Heber had separated from the main group and made peace with Jabin. So Sisera thought he'd be safe in Heber's camp. Jael came out to meet Sisera. Judges 4:18 records her words, "Come, my lord, come right in, don't be afraid." She invited him into her tent and covered him with a blanket. She showed him hospitality, making him feel safe and protected. In that culture, welcoming someone into your tent and offering them protection was a sacred trust. Sisera must have breathed a sigh of relief. He had escaped the disaster that destroyed his army. Sisera asked for water. Verse 19 tells us, he asked her for water, and she gave him milk. In a bowl fit for nobles, she brought him curdled milk. She gave him more than he asked for. Milk would be richer and more satisfying than water. The special bowl showed honor. Everything suggested he was an honored guest. Then Sisera gave her instructions in verse 20. Stand in the doorway of the tent, and if someone comes by and asks you, "Is anyone in there?" say, "No." He wanted her to lie for him, to hide him if anyone came looking. Then, exhausted from battle and flight, feeling safe at last, Sisera fell into a deep sleep. He never suspected what was about to happen. Jael had other plans. Judges 4:21 describes her actions. But Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. She drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. It happened quickly. Tent pegs were sturdy metal stakes used to secure tents to the ground. Women typically set up and took down tents, so Jael would have been skilled with hammer and peg. She knew exactly how to drive a peg through hard ground with one strong blow. She used that same skill now, driving the peg through Sisera's temple and into the ground beneath, pinning his head to the earth. The great commander who had terrorized Israel was dead, killed by a woman in a tent. When Barak came pursuing Sisera, Jael went out to meet him. Verse 22 records the scene. Just then Barak came by in pursuit of Sisera, and Jael went out to meet him. "Come," she said, "I will show you the man you're looking for." So he went in with her, and there lay Sisera with the tent peg through his temple, dead. Deborah's prophecy was fulfilled exactly. The honor of killing Sisera went not to Barak, but to a woman. Not even a woman warrior, but a housewife with a tent peg. After this great victory, Deborah and Barak composed a song to celebrate what God had done. Judges 5:1 introduces it. On that day, Deborah and Barak, son of Abinoam, sang this song. This wasn't just entertainment. It was a way to remember and teach future generations about God's mighty acts. The song would be memorized and passed down, keeping the memory of this deliverance alive. The song begins with praise in verses 2 and 3. When the princes in Israel take the lead, when the people willingly offer themselves, praise the Lord. Hear this, you kings. Listen, you rulers. I, even I, will sing to the Lord. I will praise the Lord, the God of Israel, in song. The focus is immediately on God. The people offered themselves willingly, yes, but the praise belongs to the Lord. Kings and rulers everywhere should hear this story of what God did. The song describes God's past actions, recounting how he came from Mount Sinai to help his people. Then it describes Israel's desperate situation before the deliverance. Judges 5:6-7 says, "In the days of Shamgar son of Anath, in the days of Jael, the highways were abandoned. Travelers took to winding paths. Villagers in Israel would not fight. They held back until I, Deborah, arose, until I arose, a mother in Israel." The country was in such fear that people didn't even use the main roads. Village life had stopped. No one dared to fight until God raised up Deborah. The song mentions how the tribes responded to the call to battle. Some came eagerly while others stayed behind. Judges 5:15-16 speaks of the tribe of Reuben. "In the districts of Reuben there was much searching of heart. Why did you stay among the sheep pens to hear the whistling for the flocks? In the districts of Reuben there was much searching of heart." Not everyone answered the call. Some had excuses, preferring safety to sacrifice. Then the song describes the battle itself in poetic language. Judges 5:19-21 declares, "Kings came, they fought, the kings of Canaan fought. At Taanach, by the waters of Megiddo, they took no plunder of silver. From the heavens the stars fought, from their courses they fought against Sisera. The river Kishon swept them away, the age-old river, the river Kishon." God used creation itself to fight for Israel. The river that seemed so insignificant became a weapon in God's hand. The song celebrates Jael's brave act. Judges 5:24-27 proclaims, "Most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, most blessed of tent-dwelling women. He asked for water, and she gave him milk. In a bowl fit for nobles she brought him curdled milk. Her hand reached for the tent peg, her right hand for the workman's hammer. She struck Sisera, she crushed his head, she shattered and pierced his temple. At her feet he sank, he fell, there he lay. At her feet he sank, he fell, where he sank there he fell dead. Jael is honored above all women for what she did." The song ends with a prayer in Judges 5:31. "So may all your enemies perish, Lord, but may all who love you be like the sun when it rises in its strength." Then comes a beautiful note of peace. Then the land had peace 40 years. 40 more years without oppression, without war. God had delivered his people once again through unlikely heroes, a prophetess, a reluctant warrior, and a woman with a tent peg. But the cycle continued. Judges 6.1 opens the next chapter of Israel's story. "The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites." A new enemy, a new oppression. The Midianites were nomadic people from the desert regions east of Israel. They brought a new kind of warfare that Israel had never faced before. Judges 6:3-4 describes their tactics. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep nor cattle nor donkeys. They were raiders who came at harvest time, destroying everything. Verse 5 adds, "They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count them or their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it." Imagine working all year to grow crops, then watching helplessly as hordes of invaders destroy everything right before harvest. No food stored for winter, no seed saved for next year's planting, nothing left. This happened year after year for 7 years. Judges 6:6 tells us the result. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. Israel was brought to absolute desperation. The Israelites tried to survive by hiding. Verse 2 explains, "Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. They lived like refugees in their own land, hiding in caves and mountains." One young man named Gideon was trying to save what little grain his family had grown. Judges 6:11 describes the scene. The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. Think about this picture. Threshing wheat was normally done on a hilltop where wind could blow away the chaff. It was done openly, publicly. But Gideon was hiding in a winepress, a pit carved into rock where grapes were crushed. He was working in secret in a cramped space, terrified that Midianite raiders might see him and steal his family's food. This wasn't the picture of a mighty warrior. This was a scared young man trying to survive. Then the angel spoke. Judges 6:12 records his words, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon must have looked around in confusion. Who was this stranger talking to? Surely not him. He was hiding in a hole, afraid of being discovered. But yes, the angel was speaking to him. God saw not what Gideon was, but what he would become. Gideon's response showed his doubt and frustration. Judges 6:13 records his complaint. "Pardon me, my Lord, but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." He questioned everything. If God was really with them, why were they suffering? Where were the miracles their grandparents had told them about? The Lord looked at him and gave a direct command in verse 14. "Go in the strength you have, and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" It was both a command and a promise. God was sending him. But Gideon still couldn't believe it. He protested in verse 15, "Pardon me, my Lord, but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." He felt completely inadequate. God's answer was simple and powerful. Judges 6:16 says, "The Lord answered, I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." God didn't argue about Gideon's weakness. He simply promised his presence. That was enough. But Gideon still struggled to believe. He asked for a sign. The angel accommodated him, touching Gideon's offering of meat and bread with his staff, causing fire to spring up and consume it. Then the angel disappeared. Gideon realized he had been speaking with God's messenger. That night, God gave Gideon his first assignment. Judges 6:25-26 records the command. That same night the Lord said to him, "Take the second bull from your father's herd, the one 7 years old. Tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Then build a proper kind of altar to the Lord your God on the top of this height. Using the wood of the Asherah pole that you cut down, offer the second bull as a burnt offering." This was personal. God wanted Gideon to destroy the idol in his own father's house. Gideon obeyed, but his fear still showed. Verse 27 says, "So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord told him. But because he was afraid of his family and the townspeople, he did it at night rather than in the daytime. He obeyed, but he did it secretly under cover of darkness. Still, he did it. When morning came and the people discovered what happened, they wanted to kill Gideon. But his father Joash defended him, saying if Baal was really a god, let Baal defend himself. Even after this act of obedience, Gideon still struggled with doubt. When the Midianites gathered for another raid and God's Spirit came upon Gideon to rally Israel's forces, Gideon asked for more signs. Judges 6:36-37 records his request. Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said." He needed reassurance. God graciously gave the sign. Verse 38 says, "And that is what happened. Gideon rose early the next day. He squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew, a bowlful of water. But Gideon still wasn't satisfied. He asked for the opposite sign. Judges 6:39 records, "Then Gideon said to God, 'Do not be angry with me. Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece, but this time make the fleece dry and let the ground be covered with dew.'" He knew he was pushing it, but he needed to be absolutely certain. God patiently granted this request too. Verse 40 concludes, "That night God did so. Only the fleece was dry, all the ground was covered with dew." Gideon had his confirmation. God was really going to use him to save Israel. Now it was time to act. Gideon sent messengers throughout his tribe and to neighboring tribes, calling men to join him for battle. The response was encouraging. Judges 7:1 tells us, "Early in the morning Jerubbaal, that is, Gideon, and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them, in the valley near the hill of Moreh." Verse 3 reveals how many came. "Now summon the people and proclaim in their hearing, 'Anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead.'" 22,000 men left, but 10,000 remained. That seemed like a decent army, but God had other plans. Judges 7:2 explains why. "The Lord said to Gideon, 'You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. My own strength has saved me.'" Now, God wanted it absolutely clear that the victory came from him, not from human strength or numbers. If 32,000 men won the battle, they might think they did it themselves. So God told Gideon to reduce the army. After sending home those who were afraid, 10,000 remained. But verse 4 says, "But the Lord said to Gideon, 'There are still too many men. Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you there.'" God was going to reduce the army even further, using a strange test. Judges 7:5-6 describes the test. "So Gideon took the men down to the water. There the Lord told him, 'Separate those who lap the water with their tongues, as a dog laps from those who kneel down to drink.' 300 of them drank from cupped hands, lapping like dogs. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. Most men knelt down and put their faces in the water to drink deeply, but 300 men scooped water in their hands and lapped it while staying alert, watching for danger." God made his choice clear in verse 7. "The Lord said to Gideon, 'With the 300 men that lapped I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home.'" 300 men, that's all. Gideon had to send home 99% of his army. Judges 7:8 tells us, "So Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites home, but kept the 300, who took over the provisions and trumpets of the others." Now think about the math. Verse 12 describes the enemy. The Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley, thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. Countless thousands of enemy soldiers with camels, like sand on the seashore, against 300 Israelites. It was impossible, completely impossible. Which meant when victory came, everyone would know it was God's doing. Even with all the signs God had given him, Gideon was still afraid. God knew this, so he gave Gideon one more encouragement before the battle. Judges 7:9-11 records God's kind offer. "During that night the Lord said to Gideon, 'Get up, go down against the camp, because I am going to give it into your hands. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterward, you will be encouraged to attack the camp.'" Notice God's gentle understanding. He didn't condemn Gideon for being afraid. He said, "If you are afraid," acknowledging the fear, "here's something that will help." So Gideon took his servant Purah and crept down to the edge of the enemy camp under cover of darkness. They stayed hidden at the outposts where the guards were stationed. There, Gideon overheard a conversation. Judges 7:13 records what one Midianite soldier was telling his friend. A man was telling a friend his dream. I had a dream. A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed. It was an odd dream. A loaf of barley bread, the cheapest, poorest kind of bread, attacking a tent and knocking it down. But his friend understood the meaning immediately. Verse 14 gives his interpretation. His friend responded, "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." Think about that. The Midianites were afraid of Gideon. They were having nightmares about him. They believed God was going to give them into his hands. Judges 7:15 describes Gideon's reaction. When Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed down and worshipped. He returned to the camp of Israel and called out, "Get up! The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." His fear was gone. God had shown him that the enemy was already defeated in their hearts. They were terrified. Now Gideon had the courage he needed. Gideon organized his 300 men for a most unusual battle. Judges 7:16 explains his strategy. Dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, he placed trumpets and empty jars in the hands of all of them, with torches inside. Every man got a trumpet, an empty clay jar, and a torch. These weren't weapons of war. But God doesn't need conventional weapons. Gideon gave them careful instructions in verses 17-18. "Watch me, follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp blow yours and shout, 'For the Lord and for Gideon.'" They were to copy exactly what he did. The timing had to be perfect. They moved into position around the Midianite camp in the dead of night. Judges 7:19 sets the scene. Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just after they had changed the guard. They blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. The middle watch was around midnight. The guards had just changed, so the new guards were still adjusting to the darkness, and the old guards were heading to sleep. Suddenly the night exploded with sound and light. Verse 20 continues the action. The 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars, grasping the torches in their left hands and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were to blow. They shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." From 3 directions around the camp, 300 torches suddenly blazed to life. 300 trumpets blared. 300 voices shouted the battle cry. The Midianites woke in confusion and terror. They couldn't see how many attackers there were, just torches blazing all around them in the darkness. The trumpet blasts sounded like a massive army. In their panic and darkness, they couldn't tell friend from foe. Judges 7:21-22 describes what happened. While each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. God caused supernatural confusion. The Midianites started killing each other in the darkness, thinking they were fighting Israelites. The 300 men of Israel didn't even need to fight. They just stood in position, holding their torches and blowing their trumpets, while God caused chaos in the enemy camp. The Midianite army destroyed itself. Those who survived ran for their lives. Verse 22 continues, "The army fled to Beth-shittah toward Zererah, as far as the border of Abel-meholah near Tabbath. They scattered in all directions, fleeing in blind panic. Gideon then sent word to the other Israelite tribes who had been sent home. They joined the pursuit, cutting off escape routes and striking down the fleeing Midianites. Judges 8:10 tells us the final tally. Now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor with a force of about 15,000 men, all that were left of the armies of the eastern peoples. 120,000 swordsmen had fallen. 120,000 enemy soldiers defeated by 300 men with trumpets and torches. It was impossible by human standards. But with God, Nothing is impossible. The 7 years of oppression were over. God had delivered his people again through the most unlikely means, proving that victory belongs to the Lord. After the great victory over Midian, the Israelites wanted to make Gideon their permanent ruler. Judges 8:22 records their request. The Israelites said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian." They wanted to establish a dynasty, a royal family line. After years of chaos and oppression, they craved stable leadership. Gideon's response was exactly right. Judges 8:23 gives his answer, "But Gideon told them, 'I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you.'" He understood something crucial. Israel didn't need a human king because they already had a king. God was their ruler. Gideon refused to take a position that belonged only to God. This was humble and wise. But then Gideon made a serious mistake. He had an idea that seemed reasonable at first, but led to disaster. Judges 8:24 records his request, and he said, "I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder." It was the custom of the Ishmaelites to wear gold earrings. The Midianites and their allies wore gold jewelry, and the Israelites had taken it as plunder after the victory. The people were happy to give Gideon this gift. Judges 8:25-26 tells us what happened. They answered, "We'll be glad to give them." So they spread out a garment, and each of them threw a ring from his plunder onto it. The weight of the gold rings he asked for came to 1,700 shekels, not counting the ornaments, the pendants, and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, or the chains that were on their camels' necks. 1,700 shekels was about 43 pounds of gold, a massive amount of wealth. What did Gideon do with all this gold? Judges 8:27 explains, "Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. All Israel prostituted themselves by worshipping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family." An ephod was a special garment worn by the high priest when he ministered before God. Only the high priest was supposed to wear it, and only in the tabernacle where God's presence dwelt. But Gideon made his own ephod and put it in his hometown. At first, maybe Gideon's intentions were good. Perhaps he wanted to honor God or create something to help people remember the victory. But the result was spiritual disaster. People started treating the ephod as an idol. They came to Ophrah to worship it instead of going to the tabernacle to worship God. The Bible uses harsh language. They prostituted themselves by worshiping it. They were being unfaithful to God, their true husband, by giving devotion to this object. The ephod became a trap, a snare. It caught Gideon and his family in spiritual compromise. The man who had torn down his father's altar to Baal, who had courageously led Israel to victory, now had people worshipping an object in his hometown. Even good leaders can make terrible mistakes that lead others astray. Gideon lived the rest of his life with this stain on his legacy. Gideon had many wives, and through them he had 70 sons. Judges 8:31 also mentions his concubine, who lived in Shechem, also bore him a son, whom he named Abimelech. A concubine was like a secondary wife with lower status. Abimelech grew up different from his 70 brothers. His mother's family lived in Shechem, and he spent time there among his mother's relatives rather than with his father's main family. After Gideon died, trouble began. Judges 9:1-2 records Abimelech's scheme. Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal, went to his mother's brothers in Shechem and said to them and to all his mother's clan, "Ask all the citizens of Shechem, which is better for you, to have all 70 of Jerubbaal's sons rule over you, or just one man? Remember, I am your flesh and blood." He played on family loyalty and fear. Would they rather have 70 rulers or just one? And that one was their own relative. His mother's brothers repeated his words to all the citizens of Shechem. Judges 9:3 tells us their response. When the brothers repeated all this to the citizens of Shechem, they were inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, "He is related to us." They chose him based on family connection, not character or God's will. Then verse 4 describes what happened next. They gave him 70 shekels of silver from the temple of Baal-berith, and Abimelech used it to hire reckless scoundrels who became his followers. Notice where the money came from: the temple of Baal-berith, a false god. The citizens of Shechem were funding Abimelech's ambitions with money from idol worship, and Abimelech used that money to hire thugs and criminals, men with no morals, no conscience, willing to do anything for pay. These became his personal gang of enforcers. What happened next was horrifying. Judges 9:5 records the massacre. He went to his father's home in Ophrah, and on one stone murdered his 70 brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, escaped by hiding. Abimelech slaughtered his own brothers, all 70 of them, executing them on a single stone. It was cold-blooded, calculated murder driven by raw ambition. He wanted to eliminate any rivals to his power. Only one brother survived. Jotham, the youngest, managed to hide and escape the massacre. 70 innocent men, sons of the hero who had delivered Israel, murdered by their own half-brother. And why? So one man could seize power. Judges 9:6 tells us the result. Then all the citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo gathered beside the great tree at the pillar in Shechem to crown Abimelech king. They made a murderer their king, rewarding him for his evil. The blood of 70 men stained the beginning of Abimelech's reign. Jotham, the sole survivor, didn't stay silent. When he heard that Abimelech had been crowned king, he took a courageous stand. Judges 9:7 describes what he did. When Jotham was told about this, he climbed up on the top of Mount Gerizim and shouted to them, "Listen to me, citizens of Shechem, so that God may listen to you." He stood on the mountain where blessings had been pronounced generations earlier, and he addressed the people who had crowned his brother. Jotham told them a parable, a story with a deeper meaning. Judges 9:8-9 begins, "One day the trees went out to anoint a king for themselves. They said to the olive tree, 'Be our king.' But the olive tree answered, 'Should I give up my oil, by which both gods and humans are honored, to hold sway over the trees?' The olive tree refused because it had important work producing valuable oil. Why give that up just to rule?" The story continued in verses 10-11. Next, the trees said to the fig tree, "Come and be our king." But the fig tree replied, "Should I give up my fruit, so good and sweet, to hold sway over the trees?" Again, refusal. The fig tree was producing something valuable and didn't want to abandon that for leadership. Then verses 12-13. "Then the trees said to the vine, 'Come and be our king.' But the vine answered, 'Should I give up my wine, which cheers both gods and humans, to hold sway over the trees?' All the productive, valuable trees refused to be king. They were too busy doing good work. But then the trees made a desperate choice. Judges 9:14-15 delivers the punchline. "Finally, all the trees said to the thorn bush, 'Come and be our king.' The thorn bush said to the trees, 'If you really want to anoint me king over you, come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, then let fire come out of the thorn bush and consume the cedars of Lebanon.'" A thorn bush, worthless, producing nothing of value, offering no real shade, and threatening to burn everything down if not respected. This was Jotham's picture of Abimelech. The good men had been killed. Only the worthless, dangerous one remained, and the people had made him king. The thorn bush's threat of fire was a warning of destruction to come. Jotham applied his parable directly. Judges 9:16-19 records his challenge. "Have you acted honorably and in good faith by making Abimelech king? Have you been fair to Jerubbaal and his family? Have you treated him as he deserves? Remember that my father fought for you and risked his life to rescue you from the hand of Midian. But today you have revolted against my father's family. You have murdered his 70 sons on a single stone, and have made Abimelech, the son of his female slave, king over the citizens of Shechem, because he is related to you. So have you acted honorably and in good faith toward Jerubbaal and his family today? If you have, may Abimelech be your joy, and may you be his too. But then came the curse. Judges 9:20 concludes Jotham's speech. But if you have not, let fire come out from Abimelech and consume you, the citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo, and let fire come out from you, the citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo, and consume Abimelech. He prophesied mutual destruction. Abimelech would destroy them, and they would destroy him. Fire would consume them all. Then verse 21 says, Then Jotham fled, escaping to Beer, and he lived there because he was afraid of his brother Abimelech. He delivered his message and ran for his life. Abimelech ruled over Israel for 3 years. Then God moved to bring justice for the blood that had been shed. Judges 9:23-24 explains what happened. God stirred up animosity between Abimelech and the citizens of Shechem so that they acted treacherously against Abimelech. God did this in order that the crime against Jerubbaal's 70 sons, the shedding of their blood, might be avenged on their brother Abimelech and on the citizens of Shechem who had helped him murder his brothers. God himself sent division between Abimelech and the people who had crowned him. This wasn't just human politics, this was divine judgment. God was repaying both Abimelech and the citizens of Shechem for their evil. The murder of 70 innocent men demanded justice, and God was bringing it. The citizens of Shechem turned against Abimelech. Judges 9:25 describes their rebellion. In opposition to him, these citizens of Shechem set men on the hilltops to ambush and rob everyone who passed by, and this was reported to Abimelech. They started attacking travelers, disrupting trade and peace. They were openly defying Abimelech's authority. Then a man named Gaal arrived in Shechem. Judges 9:26-27 introduces him. Now Gaal, son of Ebed, moved with his clan into Shechem, and its citizens put their confidence in him. After they had gone out into the fields and gathered the grapes and trodden them, they held a festival in the temple of their god. While they were eating and drinking, they cursed Abimelech. During a drunken party in a pagan temple, the people openly cursed the man they had crowned king just 3 years earlier. Gaal spoke boldly against Abimelech. Judges 9:28-29 records his challenge. Then Gaal, son of Ebed, said, "Who is Abimelech, and why should we Shechemites be subject to him? Isn't he Jerubbaal's son, and isn't Zebul his deputy? Serve the family of Hamor, Shechem's father. Why should we serve Abimelech? If only this people were under my command, then I would get rid of him. I would say to Abimelech, 'Call out your whole army.'" He stirred up rebellion, claiming he could defeat Abimelech if given the chance. Zebul, the governor of Shechem, who was loyal to Abimelech, heard about Gaal's words. Judges 9:30-31 tells us his reaction. When Zebul, the governor of the city, heard what Gaal, son of Ebed, said, he was very angry. Under cover, he sent messengers to Abimelech, saying, "Gaal, son of Ebed, and his clan have come to Shechem and are stirring up the city against you." He secretly warned Abimelech about the rebellion brewing in Shechem. Jotham's curse was beginning to unfold. Fire was about to break out between Abimelech and the people of Shechem. Abimelech moved quickly in response to the warning. Judges 9:34 records his strategy. So Abimelech and all his troops set out by night and took up concealed positions near Shechem in 4 companies. He surrounded the city under cover of darkness, dividing his forces into 4 groups. When morning came, Gaal was standing at the entrance to the city gate when he spotted movement. Judges 9:36-37 describes the scene. When Gaal saw them, he said to Zebul, "Look, people are coming down from the tops of the mountains." Zebul replied, You mistake the shadows of the mountains for men." But Gaal spoke up again. "Look, people are coming down from the central hill, and a company is coming from the direction of the diviner's tree." Zebul tried to deceive Gaal, but it was too late. Abimelech's forces were already in position. Then Zebul revealed his true loyalty. Judges 9:38 records his taunt. Then Zebul said to him, "Where is your big talk now, you who said, 'Who is Abimelech that we should be subject to him?' Aren't these the men you ridiculed? Go out and fight them." He threw Gaal's boastful words back in his face. Now Gaal had to back up his big talk with action. Gaal led the citizens of Shechem out to fight Abimelech. Judges 9:39-40 tells us what happened. So Gaal led out the citizens of Shechem and fought Abimelech. Abimelech chased him all the way to the entrance of the gate, and many were killed as they fled. It was a devastating defeat for Gaal. Many fell wounded, and Gaal was driven back to the city gate. Then verse 41 says, Abimelech stayed in Arumah, and Zebul drove Gaal and his clan out of Shechem. Gaal was expelled in disgrace, but Abimelech wasn't finished. The next day, the people of Shechem went out to work in their fields, perhaps thinking the conflict was over. Judges 9:42-43 describes Abimelech's trap. The next day, the people of Shechem went out to the fields, and this was reported to Abimelech. So he took his men, divided them into 3 companies, and set an ambush in the fields. When he saw the people coming out of the city, he rose to attack them. He caught them in the open, vulnerable and unprepared. The attack was brutal and complete. Judges 9:44-45 records the destruction. Abimelech and the companies with him rushed forward to a position at the entrance of the city gate. Then 2 companies attacked those in the fields and struck them down. All that day, Abimelech pressed his attack against the city until he had captured it and killed its people. Then he destroyed the city and scattered salt over it. He didn't just defeat Shechem, he utterly destroyed it. Killing the people, tearing down the buildings, and scattering salt over the ruins was a way of cursing the land, making it barren and uninhabitable. But some citizens had fled to a stronghold for safety. Judges 9:46-47 explains, On hearing this, the citizens in the tower of Shechem went into the stronghold of the temple of El-Berith. When Abimelech heard that they had assembled there, about 1,000 people, men and women, took refuge in this fortified tower attached to a temple. They thought the thick walls would protect them. Abimelech showed no mercy. Judges 9:48-49 describes his actions. He and all his men went up Mount Zalmon. He took an axe and cut off some branches, which he lifted to his shoulders. He ordered the men with him, Quick, do what you have seen me do. So all the men cut branches and followed Abimelech. They piled them against the stronghold and set it on fire with the people still inside. So all the people in the tower of Shechem, about 1,000 men and women, also died. He burned them alive. 1,000 people trapped in the tower, consumed by fire. Jotham's curse was coming true. The thorn bush's fire was consuming those who had made him king. Drunk with power and bloodshed, Abimelech moved on to the nearby town of Thebez. Perhaps they had also rebelled, or perhaps he simply wanted to complete his campaign of terror. Judges 9:50 tells us, Next Abimelech went to Thebez and besieged it and captured it. The town fell to his forces, but like Shechem, Thebez had a strong tower. Judges 9:51 describes what happened. Inside the city, however, was a strong tower, to which all the men and women, all the people of the city, had fled. They had locked themselves in and climbed up on the tower roof. Everyone in the city ran to this tower for safety. They locked the doors and went to the roof, hoping the thick walls would protect them, as they had failed to protect the people of Shechem. Abimelech approached confidently, planning to do to Thebez what he had done to Shechem. Judges 9:52 says, Abimelech went to the tower and attacked it, but as he approached the entrance to the tower to set it on fire, He was going to burn them out just like before. He walked right up to the door, probably carrying fire or fuel, preparing to ignite the entrance. But then something unexpected happened. Judges 9:53 records the moment. A woman dropped an upper millstone on his head and cracked his skull. From the roof above, a woman, we don't even know her name, took a millstone and dropped it on Abimelech's head. An upper millstone was the smaller of two stones used for grinding grain, but it was still heavy, weighing perhaps 20 to 30 pounds. It fell from the tower height straight onto Abimelech's head with devastating force, crushing his skull. Abimelech was dying, but his pride couldn't handle the manner of his death. Judges 9:54 reveals his final concern. Hurriedly he called to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and kill me, so that they can't say, 'A woman killed him.'" So his servant ran him through, and he died. Even in his last moments, he cared more about his reputation than his soul. He couldn't bear the shame of being killed by a woman, so he had his servant finish him off. Judges 9:55-56 concludes the story. When the Israelites saw that Abimelech was dead, they went home. Thus God repaid the wickedness that Abimelech had done to his father by murdering his 70 brothers. God also made the people of Shechem pay for all their wickedness. The curse of Jotham son of Jerubbaal came on them. God's justice was complete. Abimelech was dead, killed by a woman just as Sisera had been, perhaps God's way of showing that no human strength can stand against his judgment. The people of Shechem were destroyed. Jotham's curse had come to pass exactly as spoken. Fire from the thorn bush had consumed those who crowned him, and fire from them had consumed the thorn bush. After Abimelech, 2 judges, Tola and Jair, led Israel through 23 and 22 years of peace, respectively. But then the cycle repeated once more. Judges 10:6 describes Israel's sin. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They served the Baals and the Ashtoreths, and the gods of Aram, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the Ammonites, and the gods of the Philistines. And because the Israelites forsook the Lord and no longer served him, this time was even worse. They served the gods of 7 different nations, completely abandoning the true God. God's anger burned against Israel, and he allowed both the Philistines and the Ammonites to oppress them. Judges 10:8 tells us, "They shattered and crushed them. For 18 years they oppressed all the Israelites on the east side of the Jordan in Gilead, the land of the Amorites. The oppression was severe and lasted nearly 2 decades. Finally, the Israelites cried out to God, but this time God responded with words that should have shocked them. Judges 10:13-14 records God's response. "But you have forsaken me and served other gods, so I will no longer save you. Go and cry out to the gods you have chosen. Let them save you when you are in trouble." God was done with their endless cycle of betrayal. They kept running to him only when they needed rescue, then abandoning him as soon as life was comfortable. He told them to ask their idols for help. But the people persisted, genuinely repenting this time. Judges 10:16 says, "Then they got rid of the foreign gods among them and served the Lord, and he could bear their misery no longer. God's compassion overcame his anger. He couldn't stand to watch them suffer anymore. So when the Ammonites gathered for war and Israel needed a commander, God provided one, but he was an unlikely choice. Jephthah was a mighty warrior, but Judges 11:1-2 tells us his background. Jephthah the Gileadite was a mighty warrior. His father was Gilead. His mother was a prostitute. Gilead's wife also bore him sons, and when they were grown up, they drove Jephthah away. "You are not going to get any inheritance in our family," they said, "because you are the son of another woman." He was rejected by his own family because of his mother's status. He fled and lived as an outcast. But when the Ammonites threatened, the elders of Gilead came to Jephthah. Judges 11:6 records their request, "Come, be our commander, so we can fight the Ammonites." The man they had rejected was suddenly needed. Jephthah agreed, and God's Spirit came upon him to lead Israel against the Ammonites. Before the battle, Jephthah made a vow that would haunt him forever. Judges 11:30-31 records his words. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord, "If you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me, when I return in triumph from the Ammonites, will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering." It was a rash promise made in the heat of the moment, without thinking through the consequences. God gave Jephthah a great victory. Judges 11:32-33 says, "Then Jephthah went over to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gave them into his hands. He devastated 20 towns from Aroer to the vicinity of Minnith, as far as Abel-keramim. Thus Israel subdued Ammon. The victory was overwhelming and complete. Jephthah returned home as a conquering hero, but then tragedy struck. Judges 11:34 describes the heartbreaking scene. When Jephthah returned to his home in Mizpah, who should come out to meet him but his daughter, dancing to the sound of timbrels? She was an only child. Except for her, he had neither son nor daughter. His daughter, his only child, came out celebrating her father's victory. She should have been greeted with joy, but Jephthah was filled with horror. Judges 11:35 records his anguish. When he saw her, he tore his clothes and cried, "Oh no, my daughter, you have brought me down, and I am devastated. I have made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break." He had promised to sacrifice whatever came out of his house first. He never imagined it would be his beloved daughter, but he felt bound by his vow. His daughter showed remarkable courage. Judges 11:36 gives her response. "My father, you have given your word to the Lord. Do to me just as you promised, now that the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the Ammonites." She accepted her fate, asking only for 2 months to mourn with her friends. Judges 11:39 concludes the tragedy. After the 2 months she returned to her father, and he did to her as he had vowed. And she was a virgin. Jephthah kept his vow, and his daughter paid the price for her father's rash words. After Jephthah, 3 more judges, Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon, led Israel for brief periods. Then the cycle repeated, with the longest and most severe oppression yet. Judges 13:1 opens a new chapter. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, so the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. 40 years. An entire generation grew up knowing nothing but Philistine domination. During this dark time, God began preparing a deliverer in an unexpected way. There was a man from the tribe of Dan named Manoah, whose wife couldn't have children. Judges 13:3 tells us what happened. The angel of the Lord appeared to her and said, "You are barren and childless, but you are going to become pregnant and give birth to a son." This was a miraculous promise, a child for a woman who had been unable to conceive. But this wouldn't be just any child. The angel gave specific instructions in verses 4-5. "Now see to it that you drink no wine or other fermented drink, and that you do not eat anything unclean. You will become pregnant and have a son whose head is never to be touched by a razor, because the boy is to be a Nazirite, dedicated to God from the womb. He will take the lead in delivering Israel from the hands of the Philistines." The child would be a Nazirite, someone specially set apart for God, with strict rules about not cutting hair, not touching dead bodies, and not drinking alcohol. The woman told her husband about the angel's visit. Manoah prayed that God would send the angel again to teach them how to raise this special child. God answered his prayer, and the angel appeared again, repeating the instructions. When Manoah offered to prepare food, the angel told him to offer it as a sacrifice to God instead. Judges 13:19-20 describes what happened. Then Manoah took a young goat together with the grain offering and sacrificed it on a rock to the Lord. And the Lord did an amazing thing while Manoah and his wife watched. As the flame blazed up from the altar toward heaven, the angel of the Lord ascended in the flame. They realized they had been speaking with God's messenger. The child was born just as promised. Judges 13:24-25 concludes the introduction. The woman gave birth to a boy and named him Samson. He grew, and the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him while he was in Mahane Dan, between Zorah and Eshtaol. His name was Samson, and from the beginning, God's Spirit was active in his life. He would grow to become the strongest man Israel had ever known, famous for incredible feats of strength. His story would mark the beginning of Israel's deliverance from the Philistines, though complete freedom wouldn't come until later generations. If this journey through the Judges has impacted you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that subscribe button to continue exploring these powerful Bible stories with us, and share this video with someone who needs to hear about God's faithfulness today. Your support helps us bring these ancient accounts to life for a new generation. Let's keep discovering God's Word together. Subscribe now and join our community of Bible story seekers.